share the screen. Can you all see the screen? Yeah, and you can all hear me? Okay, I'm going to get rid of all your lovely faces now. Unfortunately, it'll be just mine or Philip's. Why it's Philip's? Okay, maybe not. Maybe I'll leave you all there. Okay, so you can all hear me. So in the previous few weeks, we've been kind of looking at some of the migration or the exodus from the Middle East through Greece onto Spain and eventually into Ireland. And in particular, we were looking at three of the tribes, being Zarah-Judah, which is part of the royal tribe of Judah, Dan and Simeon. And last week we looked in particular, as a reminder, maybe just to this, obviously Ibernia is the old name for Spain, or the Iberian Peninsula, with the BER already in it is interesting. But last week we looked, and the last 2 weeks we really looked at the Hyksos kings, that they were possibly linked with the tribe or of Zarah of Judah, and how through Dara, that they may have set up Troy in Greece, the Trojan War. We'll move on to Tara and Londinium maybe next week, and County Meath, which is where Tara is. And then also at the same time, from Egypt, that possibly Zara used the ships of Dan, and Dan may have been known as the Danoni, or the sea people, who also moved into Greece and may have been linked to either Athens or possibly Sparta. Simeon could have been linked to Sparta as well. We looked the first week how the two census in the book of Numbers and how they dramatically changed, and that they may have decided to leave the main body that went on into Palestine with Moses, and how eventually they'll come into Iberia and eventually into Hibernia, which is the old name of Ireland, very similar to the name, of course, of the Iberia, which is the Spanish Peninsula. So we're kind of, just bear in mind, just it's very hard, as I said the first week. I'm not a historian. Migrations of people. And in particular, we're going to look in the north of Spain and some of this area to this evening, just to see some of the Israelite names and maybe some of those people that eventually moved on into Hibernia. Next week, we'll look at Hibernia, which is, of course, Ireland. So just very quickly, hopefully you can see all that. So we looked at the two lines on Judah. Most of us are familiar with the Phares line because it's in the book of Kings and leads on to the Lord, and of course leads on to Zedekiah, who eventually dies in Babylon. And it'll link back to, obviously this line does link back to this line, which is the Zara line, eventually in Ireland, which we'll possibly look at next week. So we've seen, I don't know, most people have probably seen this picture floating around different fellowship prophecy evenings, or maybe some of the literature or the books that we use. And you can already see, I never really paid attention, I suppose, that much to the fact that there was the Cretan kings, which comes from Crete, and the Trojan kings. So there's the whole Greece influence here, and eventually this link with the Milesians is very important, and how it comes into Ireland, and that Milesian kings is very important in the link with Spain as well in Ireland. And of course, most of us, as a reminder, know these emblems. Maybe in particular, some people don't know Simeon, but the castle and the sword, which in particular we'll see maybe later on as we move into Ireland, and we'll touch on a little bit in one place anyway in Spain this evening, hopefully, and the Red Hand of Ulster, and the rampant red line, of course, which is Judah, and these are the emblems of Dan, mainly the serpent and the eagle, and of course the adder biting the back of the horse. So this is just more a reminder. I'm not really going to go through all this again. Just the fact that Troy may have been an Israelite affair, with the fact, as I've already alluded to the fact that Sparta, had the emblem of the eagle on their ships. There's also a letter between Sparta and some Jews later on that talk about that they're brothers, not necessarily Jews. And of course, then we've mentioned about Zarah setting up Judah, setting up Troy. And of course, there was Helen that was stolen by Paris and brought back to Troy, as it says in the Iliad, and how the Trojan War began. So obviously, after the Trojan War and further down the line, these people, or some of these people, will migrate further onto other countries. This is just some of the reminder again of this link between Zarah and in particular these two lads here, Darda and Calcol, which we kind of touched on last week. Darda being what links to Troy, and Calcol, who kind of starts to link with the Irish migration of people. Oh, don't know what happened there. Yeah, so just as a reminder. And of course, 300 is interesting because, Gideon, of course, had 300 men that defeated a great army in the Old Testament. It's interesting that 300, which was the movie, of course, to do with the Spartans holding off the Persians. Again, there's this link. Again, in Greek, tradition, most of us know about Hercules and all of that. Of course, Samson, who's the strong man in the Old Testament, was, of course, from the tribe of Dan. So maybe that was rebranded. So coming to this evening now, as we move from Greece more to Spain, and just to get a familiar picture of the geography of Spain. Just before we go there, it's funny, there's a guy on the way to work and he has a flag of all the Celtic nations. It caught my attention a while back, very unusual. He's actually from Cornwall, this is his flag, but he has all these flags. Very unusual banner to see, all the flags of the Celtic nations. Most of us are familiar with Ireland, Wales, Cornwall probably, Brittany and Scotland. But of course, there's Galicia, the Isle of Man. There's this other one, Canterbury, and Asturias, which I think are all up here in the north of Spain. And this north of Spain has a big link with the different people that come into Ireland. The Irish annals talk about, Irish history and Irish tradition talks a lot about people coming from Greece through Spain and on up to Hibernia or on up to Ireland. On the right hand side, just as a pointer, you can see already in Spain where there's a famous name called Zaragoza, which means, we have most of us are familiar with Gaza, the Gaza Strip in the Middle East. Well, that would be the same word linguistically as you could say Gaza, as well as Zaragoza. Zara, of course, is the link back to Judah. Actually, not too far from Barcelona. Over here is a place called Tarragona, which is onto the Middle East. So you could see how the ships would come in here and use that river all the way up to the north of Spain. That river is called the Ebro River, which is again linked to the word Hebrew, just like the Iberian Peninsula is linked to Hebrew. The word Hibernia is linked to Hebrew, because before Abraham, that's what the people would have been known as the Hebrew people. And the father of the Hebrews, of course, is Eber, E-B-E-R. So we can see linguistically how that name has moved across from east to west. So down here, again, we've just for maps' sake, we've moved from here over the Middle East. There's a place, I'll just zoom in on this for a sec. So over here is kind of where there's a famous river called the Dardanelles River, which is called the Bosphorus. And that Dardanelles River maybe comes from the name Darda or Dara that we've seen, the son of Zarah. Miltis may be where the name Miletian comes from. It's kind of on Turkey, not too far from Ephesus. And these people would have been moving from over here around the islands of Athens and Sparta. So you can see from the Mediterranean, even as we said, Sardinia could come from the word Zardan, as in Zar for Zara, and Dinia for Dan. Possibly. These are all possiblies. But definitely, there's no doubt in history that this is where people's moved from. And we might have a look at some of the other names in a sec, but that's just to give a little idea. Note that the Scythians from Spain were known as Miletians throughout the Irish annals. They were known as Miletians. This guy, Peter Berford, one of the foremost Celtic scholars, now writes the Gaelic noble dynasties of Ireland, the indigenous Gaelic aristocrats of Ireland is without the most ancient in Europe. The Irish houses have genealogies tracing their descent generation by generations from the son of Golof. We'll have a look at him in a sec. Otherwise known as Milsis or Milis Spain. The Irish always called Spain, Spain. Nobody else ever really called Spain until later on, because Spain used to be made up of different provinces. And it's interesting that Mill of Spain is known as a soldier. And the interesting thing with the Israelites, and it's not, it would make common sense that European culture tends to have nobles and common people. You wouldn't disagree with that. Throughout history, there's been always monarchies. Even when Nehemiah goes back to build the Jerusalem, he actually has a go against the nobles, the people that were of kind of aristocrats, stock or blood. So it wouldn't be unusual that maybe that Zara, as people from Zara move along these migrations, that also some of the other tribes would. And I'm gonna suggest possibly that the Miletian common man, if you like, was possibly some of Simeon. We've seen that Simeon was is a character that's kind of hot-tempered, him and Levi in the Old Testament. And we see that if they linked with Sparta, which was militaristic, then you could see how the Miletians, who were known as soldiers, and they were linked to the Zara line, how they'd be called Mill of Spain, is known as a soldier of Spain, who according to tradition arrived in Ireland at the end of the second millennium, or maybe 1000 BC. Hard to put dates on these things. You only have to start looking up Irish history, and it's quite it can be a bit confusing. But this name Miletian could be used to designate people of Miltis, which is in Asia Minor, which is where they would have migrated from as they moved across the Mediterranean and into North Spain. So it should perhaps not surprise us that we would find the name Milesian in both ancient Turkey and even Spain, since they were undoubtedly related people. And it seems like there was a number of different colonies around Greece at this time. The Milesians of Spain were from different names. Milsis, Millet, the father of Ireland's Milesian dynasty from Spain, also called Golaf or Gatalis. And you can see maybe where the word Gaul comes from, or the word Gaelic comes from. Galatians, remember in the book of, even in the New Testament, the Galatians who were in Asia Minor were actually Celtic by tradition. This, in fact, is some proof that Ireland's traditional histories link it to the Milesians and those of the Aegean, which is another name for Greece. So we can see that there's kind of this link again between Greece and Spain with Ireland. This is just another map again. Coming to Zaragoza, going up the river, we're going to look at the emblem of Castilla, and also up to Galicia, which is probably the port that most of them would have gone over to Ireland from. So this is a map of Spain. This is coming down by Malaga, coming around here, the boats maybe this way, or you could use the river up this way. What do we have here? Yeah, and sometimes when you put the name on somebody, you know, somebody's name, like originator of obviously the tribe of Dan, but his name could become, as we know, when it comes to Ireland, the Tuatha Dé Danann or the Danoni and stuff like that. So the name of probably the father or the original can be put onto people to represent them, if that makes sense. So the name Golaf and its personal names, rather they simply denote nationality. Obviously, there was probably one guy called at the beginning. There's not just one guy that's called Gael, because the Irish are called the Gaels, the Scots are called the Gaels, the Welsh can be called the Gaels, the people from Brittany. Cadmus was another Israelite who had Phoenician connections and who established the city-state of Thebes in Greece. Colchis, a colony on the Black Sea coast, was apparently settled by Israelites as they performed the act of circumcision. Athens was founded by King Cecrops, who some writers state was Calcol, the son of Zarah, a Judite. Calcol is also credited with setting a colony in Ulster and Ireland and the origins of the Irish kings, which we'll look into in a little bit more detail next week. And his brother Darda is credited with going on to Troy. And then we know when Troy fell, later on Brutus eventually and his people made their way over to New Troy, which became known as Londinium by the Romans and is known by us today as London. The ancient Irish legends tell of 5 invasions, all of which came from the regions of Greece. The first 3 failed, but the 4th was successful by people called the Tuatha Dé Danann, who were deeply entrenched in Irish history for many years. The name is translated into the tribe of Dan. Most of us would probably agree with that. The 5th invasion was by the Milesians. There wasn't just one invasion. There was a number of invasions over time with the Milesians, as it tends to happen. Everybody didn't go to the United States or Australia all at once. There was somebody paved the way, and then there was other migrations. It was from the Milesian line of Greeks that the ancient Irish kings, again, Calcol. Calcol is reported to if you take out the vowels again, could be linked to Dan. It becomes most interesting at this point. There is a city in Spain today, as we've seen on the map, called Zaragoza. On the Hebrew River, Zaragoza can be broken into Zara, Gaza, which means Zara's stronghold. Recall that Zarah was one of the twins of Judah, which we looked. The peninsula of Spain and Portugal is known anciently as the Iberian Peninsula. Iberia refers to Hebrew in some ancient language. Hebrew also means Hebrew. Spain was an important settlement area of the Hebrews through Calcol and others. Calcol is accredited, again, we're going just reiterating, to Ireland, which was known as Hibernia, or possibly the land of the Hebrews. And then, of course, on the Darda side of the Zara line, Brutus went over to England. This is just, I just found this kind of a bit interesting with the name Golf, because there's a place on the west coast of Ireland called Galway. And when you look at the Gaelic, it's Galif, which is very similar linguistically to this name. And of course, Galway are known as the tribesmen, and their emblem is the rampant lion. So it's just an interesting thought. This is just really reiterating what we've already said. I don't know why I put that in again. And again, this is just backing up again from another source about how this flow of the Milesian Zarites started to arrive in Spain and into Ireland. And I mentioned about Castilla, I met up the north, not quite over beside Galicia. And its emblem is the rampant lion as well, the red lion of Judah, and also the castle, which could represent Simeon, because that's his emblem. So the two of them are going together. Yeah, I'm not going to read all this. It's that flow from the Middle East is flowing towards Spain and onto Ireland. Just to give us another maybe better view here. So again, I mentioned Tarragona. So Tara, of course, is very much linked with Ireland, and Tarragona is the first place where this Hebrew River flows up and on up to La Coruña, which is where the Celtics. If you go out, it's funny. We used to have Rachel's colleague who was from Barcelona, and she was married to an Irish guy. And they used to say when they went to La Coruña that if you go over there, you think you're actually in. He's from Dublin, and he says, if I didn't hear the accents, I'd think I was in Dublin, just with the features of the people and the Basques and stuff. And a lot of the DNA that they've looked at, even in Trinity College in Dublin, that they see that some of the people that link most with the Irish, they showed a picture of on the west coast of Ireland, there was a pub in Galway, and they showed it in the Basque region. And you couldn't really tell the difference, just the characteristics and how they went on. I just want to mention as well that these places, Malaga, Cadiz, they were originally Hebrew names. Makadish, I think, was Malaga, we'll see in a minute, and Cadiz was Gads. So that may have been Gades, maybe linked to Gad, which means to be enlarged. Again, just as you start to see the word Iberia, and you just start to think, and of course, it's interesting that Gibraltar is still owned by the UK today. The very, very important strategic point for military and for position ever since, even if you go back to the Phoenicians, who, I would be of the opinion were really Solomon mixed with Tyre and Zidon, that they used to be the Royal Britannia of the ancient world. And they used to always have this spot here as it's a very strategic point. Even later on, when Israel fell and they took over Carthage, which became an outpost for the Israelites, and we know that the Carthaginians had famous wars against the Romans. They were known as the Punic Wars, which is phonetically the same word as Phoenician. Punic and Phoenician. Anyway, another interesting thing is, of course, is possibly that Tarshish may be another name for Spain. Some people think it's the UK. Some people think it's Spain. Would make sense at the time that he jumps into a boat in Joppa, Joppa was where Dan was under the Danaanites, under Israel. And of course, he wanted to move away from Nineveh, so he got on a boat going to a familiar place where Israelites would have went to, which I believe was possibly Tarshish, which was just a colony at one stage of Israel. Whole reason why Jonah ran away, but that's for another day. One of the things is there's a guy in 1 Kings 4:6 and 5:14 who seems to have been, his name was Adoram, and he may have been King Solomon's tax collector. And the interesting thing is, in 1846, they found a grave in Spain, and his name belonged to this fella, Adoram. So I'm just making the point that at the time, Solomon, who was possibly, when the Phoenician Empire was at its height, remember Solomon's navy used to spend 3 years going around before it came back, and it took all sorts of stuff from around the world back to Solomon. That if Tarshish, which was Spain possibly, that this guy, the tax collector, when he gets killed, his grave is in Spain, in Tarshish, which is kind of a bit interesting if you think of it. The possibility, it says, because really there was a bit of a revolt against Solomon because he did have high taxes. And what are people like when they have high taxes? They tend to revolt. As you see, you kick out the government and you bring in the government that's promising cheaper taxes. Whoops, sorry. So I just thought that was interesting. So just coming back now to probably into the last leg of this evening. So in Galicia, in La Coruña, up the north of Spain, there's a famous fella called Brogan's Tower. That's a statue there in Coruña. And you just hear the name Brogan. I'll show you next week a couple of famous Brogans in Ireland to do with Dublin. And this fella Brogan, again in the Irish annals, is meant to be described as the ancestor of the Gaels. Is this the same guy as Golliff? Is it the same guy as Milda that we mentioned earlier? Maybe. I don't know. He founded a city in anyway called Brigantia, which is in the north of Spain, in Coruña. And the idea that the Irish Gaels came from Hispania may be based on the similarity of the names Zegru and Hibernia and the names Galicia and Gael, because it is Celtic. But this tower of Brigantia, and his son was Boyle, who was in turn the father of Milces, also called Mill of Spain. This is the problem with sometimes trying to get one story. The names change, but whether he's called Milces, whether he's called Mill of Spain, whether he's called Brogan, or whether he's called Golov, it seems to be the same people leaving this spot, coming over into Ireland, if that makes sense. So when you look at it, it's interesting that that place is called the Briganti, because the Brigantes were a famous Celtic tribe who moved into Ireland and also into England, up the north of England, especially around Yorkshire. The Celtic goddess was called Brigantia, and maybe under the Catholic tradition later on was changed to Saint Bridget, which is quite famous in Ireland. There's a special cross for Saint Bridget. So we see again that the Briganti move across. The word Briganti in Celtic, Brigham supplies the base meaning hill. In Welsh it's called Bryn or Bryn, and in Cornish Brie, Breton and Cubic. So we see that they could be described as Highlanders, maybe, or people that were elevated, the elevated ones. So this place, or these people called the Briganti, which is interesting when we see later on, because some of the Highlanders in Scotland, which mainly came from Ireland, got that name, the Highlanders. So we see things replicating itself later on down in history. But just this, to think that he names this place the Brigantes, he finds this place, this guy Brogan, who's linked to the Milesians. He finds this city called Brigante, and eventually the Brigantes move over from the north of Spain into more or less over here, which is kind of Waterford, Wexford area. Dublin's up here, Kerry's over here, and also up here. Of course, the Romans tried to, as they always do, tried to change the story when it links to the scriptures, as we're very much aware of. The oldest legend telling the story of the tower refers to the kingdom of Brigantia, into a king Brogan that sent his people to populate Ireland. Supposedly he was able to see from the tower. This is just Irish, probably exaggeration, or saying he could see from the tower Ireland, because all along the Milesians, in their traditions, were told by their ancestors that they had to make land eventually in the island of Destiny, or Inishfail, which was Ireland. So they always, that's why they never stopped and settled just in one place. I might just show this in this, I think. Can you see, can you see that? Actually, maybe I'll go back because it'll probably just confuse. Let me see if I can drill into this. I found this on, you know, the way you can look up ancestors. So if you wanted to look up your family tree and see where the Murphys came from, or to see where the Breretons came from, or to see where the Duncans came from, you can go on to all of these things. So there's one for Milces, who's son of Boyle, born in Spain and deceased in Ireland. We're going to see next week how these people came from Galicia, these people, the Brogans or the Milesians, whatever you want to call them, how they came over to Ireland and eventually took over Ireland from the Tuatha Dé Danann, or the Tuatha Dé Danann eventually assimilated in with them, and they became the rulers of Ireland. And in particular, the royal part of it starts to move towards the north, up towards Ulster, and down the south, possibly around Kerry, actually, is where some of the other Milesians settled and moved on. But it's just interesting if we've been around, you see, maybe this gives a little bit. So Galuf is king of Spain. He's called Milces. He has a son of Boyle, who's the son of Brogan, the king of Galicia, Andalusia, Castile. And he has this Bon is the wife of Boyle. And then you see married to this Don, son of Milces. I'm just mentioning these names because a lot of those names are very familiar to us if you've been around. We know Scotia, we know Okad, who will be the High King of Ireland when Timar Talfi comes over. Heber and Fionn, who are sons of Milces. Those names are very much Israelite names, the name Heber. And Era, which if you think Ireland, comes from the word IRE, son of Milces. Aran, we have the Aran Islands, which are just off the coast of Galway. So we just see how these names are still with us today. And a lot of these names linguistically link back to Israelite names. Actually, I might just this. You see, this is another story again of possibly in Melilce's youth and during his father's lifetime, he went into Scythia, where he was kindly received by the king of that country, who gave him his daughter in marriage and made him a general of his forces. Milces defeated the king's armies, gained much fame and the love of all the king's subjects. His growing greatness and popularity excited against him the jealousy of the king, who, fearing the worst, resolved on putting Milces privately out of the way, for he openly dared not attempt it. Milces, having heard of the king's intention, slew him, left Scythia, retired into Egypt with a fleet of 60 set sail. Under this Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, being informed of his arrival and of his great valor, wisdom, conduct of ours, made him a general of his forces against the king of Ethiopia and then invading his country. Here, Scythia was victorious. He forced the army to submit the conquerors unto his terms, and by these exploits, Milces found great favor with Pharaoh, who gave him his daughter. And then it goes on to talk about how he came back to Spain and how eventually the Milesians came over to Ireland, and eventually the Celts came from them, and etc. links to Heber and Er, just which we just spoke about. My point is that there's 3 or 4 different stories, but a lot of the names and the places seem to stem all around from the same thing, talking about Egypt, Greece, Spain, Ireland. It's just a bit of it's very hard to put the A to Z that it went exactly this way. But what is interesting is the fact, again, here's another thing about the Scythian map, about how different people migrated. So you see, they may have bounced around a bit before they ended up here, but nobody has one story that fits it all. The point is that they flowed, as we've often mentioned, from east to west. They may have gone back to east and come back to west, but eventually we know the beginning of the story is in the Middle East, and we know the end of it is in the Isles of the West, which kind of links back again to our summary in case you got lost. Can you? That looks a bit funny, doesn't it? The old masks are coming on now. I'm sorry, you would have got me germs by now. Anyway, so just where we started, again, just to keep with all the detail, just to keep in a picture in your head about how Zarah and Dan and Simeon are moving across from east to west. And it's through following the names, how names of places, legends, stories, that we get to see where they eventually ended up, because God said that's where they'd end up. So if God said it, that's where they have to end up. It's the bit in the middle that's always a little bit of a roller coaster ride, But it's interesting because when we get to the end of it next week, we'll narrow it right down, especially to Dublin and Limerick, which is in particular very close to Kerry. And we link some of these peoples and some of the names that are still in Irish heraldry today that link to some of this heraldry that we've already seen with these peoples as they flow across from east to west. And I'll say amen for tonight.